Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Vinsel. You know, a great professional pleasure in academia, but probably other professions too, is to sit back, survey your field, and say, we've got too much of this and not enough of that, whatever this and that are. It's a deeply satisfying activity. It has a wonderful mouthfeel. You can roll it around your palate, and it has a nice feeling in your belly too. It's just great. Like in science and technology studies, we have way too much work on emerging technologies, including technologies that are little more than promissory notes. This leads to superficial work because it turns out to be quite difficult to study things that do not actually exist in the world. LMAO. What else do we have too much of? Let's see. Hold on. You're going to work on AI? No way. I'm so shocked that I'm having trouble catching my breath. I just can't believe it. You're a path breaker, a truly original thinker. What do we not have enough research on? Oh man, the list is so long. Septic tanks, trailer parks, elevators and pest control in public housing, infrastructure in small towns with declining populations. What else? Whew, I could go on all day. Oh, here's another big one, place. These days, we do not have so many studies that focus on how technological and industrial change affect a place and the beings that inhabit it. Not just humans, but all the critters. Oh, but you're in luck. In walks Christina Dunbar-Hester's recent book, Oil Beach, How Toxic Infrastructure Threatens Life in the Port of Los Angeles and Beyond. Dunbar-Hester's book takes a multi-species approach to examine how petroleum production and refining and the heavy industrialization required for one of the most active ports on the planet has affected a wide variety of animals, yes, including us humans. The book is a wonderful examination of place, a place Dunbar-Hester moved to several years ago when she became a professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. For my money, Dunbar-Hester is one of the most important scholars working in science and technology studies today. Oil Beach is her third book, and I have found much to appreciate in her other two books, especially her first one, Low Power to the People, Pirates, Protest, and Politics in FM Radio Activism, which is one of my favorites and which we discuss a bit in the interview. And I was overjoyed when I learned she was turning from her last book, Hacking Diversity, which was on the digital culture of the open technology movement, to the study of rusty, creaky, and leaking petroleum and port infrastructure. Huzzah! Moreover, Dunbar-Hester cannot be that much older than me, if she is, and yet for a long time, I have looked up to her as a scholar. And she has also been helpful to me in that she is not afraid to tell me when she thinks I am barking up the wrong tree, which is, hey, the kind of feedback one needs in life. I am absolutely certain Christina thinks I am sometimes a jerk, which, let's be real folks, is simply true, and she lets me know it, which helps. It's for all these reasons, scholarly, professional, and personal, that it was such a pleasure to finally have Christina Dunbar-Hester on Peoples and Things. I had a wonderful time. I hope you do too. Hey, get excited! Christina, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Lee. It's great to be here. Great to see you.
So, Oil Beach is a neat book. When you explain it to strangers, if you ever have to do that these days, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with it?
Well, I guess I can quickly tell if people are on the wavelength of the book or need to sort of be oriented at first principles. For people who have familiarity with LA at all, which I really didn't when I moved here for work almost 8 years ago, it's about the infrastructure that's kind of hiding in plain sight in Los Angeles, which is not particularly part of its public image or, again, sort of most popular representations. And that is both the oil history here, the petroleum extraction, and also refining, and also the port shipping, which did get into the headlines a bit with supply chain snarls during the early stages of the pandemic. But a lot of the time, these are just completely kind of obscured and invisibilized in popular understanding of this region. And even for people who live here, they'll know about it, but it's not something that's talked about all that much. So the book is kind of trying to surface and, denaturalize the naturalized invisibility of those topics. And so it's an academic book, but it's attempting to, sort of cross over and appeal to wider audiences than just narrow disciplinary ones. So
that's cool. And for folks who don't know much about this history or like what's going on now, is how much refining and extraction is is it mostly like a historical burden kind of thing, or is there still a lot of that going on?
Yeah, so both. The majority of the coastal oil has been extracted and new permits are granted rarely on the coast. So California is less of an oil producer than it used to be, although there is still fracking for oil and gas inland, not visible on the coast. California is really prominent, though, for refining and just being reliant on petroleum. And so, like, Los Angeles County is now moving to ban new extraction and to enforce setbacks so that oil extraction infrastructure isn't like right on top of homes, schools, playgrounds, churches. You might think that wouldn't be possible, but it is. But this is sort of rapidly turning into, I would say, also a legacy problem where there's old infrastructure, that's maybe decommissioned, but maybe arguably not safe to be around if it's not being, inspected and sort of its decommissioning being maintained, something I know you know a lot about. And so even as extraction has diminished, there is this, sort of ghost infrastructure really present everywhere. And near where I live, for instance, there are wells that you can see that actually at first glance, you can't tell if they're completely decommissioned or if they're just like pumping oil really, really slowly, because they're like almost completely still, but they haven't been dismantled. And then if you actually look at a geologic survey map of the energy infrastructure, you can see that there were a lot of wells that have been decommissioned, that again, probably, technocrats know about more than residents. But it's really, really sort of present and visible in a lot of different places.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to do on this show is kind of give people a sense of, the listeners a sense of scholars as human beings, with stories about how they got into stuff. And so I wanted to give people this is your third book, and so I kind of wanted to give people a sense of your arc. And you got your PhD in the Science and Technology Studies Department at Cornell. Who did you work with there? I mean, who were your main folks?
My committee was chaired by Ron Klein, who's historian of engineering and is retired or retiring now. And then also Trevor Pinch, who is obviously as a, cast a long shadow and departed us a little over a year ago. And Mike Lynch. And so those are both, qualitative sociologists of science and technology. And then lastly, Dominic Boyer, who's an anthropologist who was at Cornell during those years. And so, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. My advisor being a historian and me being more of an ethnographer, led to conversations that were often sort of probing those similarities and differences. And he would always say, I'm going to let the people who do ethnographic work keep you honest methodologically. And then we would just sort of talk about, context and interpretation, which were goals for both. And so actually Oil Beach is a recent historical work, which I was approached with some trepidation and then just decided, well, I'm going to go for it. But yeah, for a variety of reasons, it's not ethnographic and immersive in sort of active communities of people the way the earlier two books were.
Yeah, that's interesting. So your dissertation and then your first book were, which I love your first book. It's like maybe my favorite first book of our generation of STS scholars, but they were focused on low-powered FM radio activism. So the book's called Low Power to the People, Pirates, Protest, and Politics in FM Radio Activism. So how'd you get onto that? I mean, what was going on that you were like, this is what I want to look into?
Well, as usual, it's a sort of, it wasn't a very linear path, shall we say. I had an undergrad background in history and sociology of science topics and also urban studies. And when I was thinking about going back to grad school, I was really interested in the sort of, this is the late 90s, efflorescence of independent media projects and claims about sort of democratic media and being the media. A lot of this was getting very intense in the years right after the 1996 Telecommunications Act that really consolidated radio and broadcasting and, was meant to kind of respond to this burgeoning technology, the, internet. And so I was interested in those sort of claims about, democratic media and access to technology, but I really didn't know what I was doing very much at all, and approached mentors from undergrad who said, well, that sounds interesting, but it sounds like communication and media, and we don't know anything about that, and we'll write you letters, but good luck. And so I applied to a handful of mostly communication and media studies and some cultural studies programs. So I kind of thought I wasn't doing STS work. There wasn't as much sort of cross-pollination between STS and common media as there is now. Like now that's not a remarkable intersection, but at that time, I think it kind of was. And part of how I wound up ultimately picking Cornell was they actually said, well, to be honest, we don't really have many people doing work like this, but it sounds interesting and, we'll help you explore it or figure it out if it's what you wind up doing. And I thought that was actually a really, generous attitude and, realistic, not overselling it. But, I think I had a knowledge that lenses of both, common media studies and STS, or an intuitive sense that those would all be useful, but I wasn't really sure, which end of the telescope I'd be looking out of primarily. But I didn't have any plan to write about, low power radio or anything. That came a bit later, after I had done some coursework and was sort of nosing around for a research project, that ultimately became the dissertation, but it was actually just a kind of summer practicum when I initiated it. And I thought I was looking at kind of, imaginaries and practical realities, comparing web broadcasting or webcasting or whatever you want to call it, and FM broadcasting by a small project of the Philadelphia Independent Media Center. So I went down to study that. And then in classic sort of anthropological ethnographic encounter, what happened was the group, right when I arrived, had this big internal fight and meltdown. And I wasn't actually welcome to do what I thought I was going to do because it was sort of sensitive and people were nothing to do with me, just emotions were running high. And so I kind of hung back in a mode where I wasn't, having to plead for access with people who are, in a sort of raw state emotionally. And that led to the tinkering group that is, that activity is prominent in that book, where people were building radio hardware and, viewing that as a sort of radical, democratic, emancipatory, and even sort of feminist practice.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, I think, hindsight is, 2020 maybe, but also biased. I think what I wound up doing was more interesting than what I had set out to do. And so I often tell students this, it's okay if your intentions, go awry a bit. Negotiating access with live humans is something that, has to be done and re-upped and renegotiated, and, consent has to be given.
Totally.
And so that's what wound up happening. So hacking diversity was this distributed phenomenon. And I was, trying to capture something that was happening in a lot of different spaces and places. And that was an analytic choice, but it also meant that with some exceptions, I didn't have a sort of deeper rapport with folks.
Yeah.
And everything about that just made me feel a little bit, I just needed a break from doing that again. And then I moved. Yeah. So I was once again in a setting where I didn't have deep ties, and it felt, kind of pushing it with being, too extractive to try to set up shop with ethnographic work right away. And I felt, as I said, the sort of how I would be in relation with, quote, research subjects. I just wasn't ready to sort of start that up again for myself and for others. Yeah, go ahead.
Burnt out, a good description? Was that the feeling, or like?
It was burnt out, and it was also, that book was not the easiest for me to write.
Yeah,
because of some of that stuff, because of, moving jobs and locales very late on the tenure track. And so, if I'm being completely candid, that book had to come out, and some of the feelings in the research were hard, and some of the feelings about the production of the book were not the easiest. And it just, I needed to recharge some, and, personally and intellectually. And so Oil Beach really sort of came out of that, where I was just like, now I have tenure. Now I need a palate cleanser. Now I need to give myself and other humans a break from, scrutinizing their utterances.
Good.
And so, and I think I had at that point been, there was a critical mass of, multispecies and, non-human sorts of things in STS that I hadn't been paying close attention to. How it is. I hadn't done a ton of new reading since my, dissertation and things that, kind of, sort of were, spurring off of that. And so I just was thrilled to be able to read again. And
that must have been fun.
It was. And I just was in a new place, and I was really, really curious about the environment I found myself in. And so honestly, it's kind of again, if I'm being candid, it's just a sort of self-indulgent myself trying to learn about the, environment that I was in as both kind of, natural and industrial history. That was all very new to me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's part of how I think of it too. It's you're learning about your surroundings in a very real way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was doing that work anyway, and then realized I can turn this into research and, harmonize that and give myself a break from these, projects about tech and conflict.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
Yeah, good. And so say a bit about what kind of research did you do? This was a shift for you. So what was, what did you do, and what was it like making that shift?
I remember having a conversation with you at a for us, I guess, in Boston, where I was like expressing a lot of nervousness about archival and, documentary interpretive work. But yeah, one thing that happened was I had already decided that there might be, kind of like ethnographic encounter in the book a little bit, but I wasn't going to sort of center on people and negotiate access in that way. There was also just a lot of, there were annual reports and financial data and things that I could get to, online and through libraries. So I didn't do physical archives work, but I found a lot of, again, like kind of gray literature, annual reports and municipal documents and kinds of things. And in the course of just reading them to, do a first pass, what are the arcs here and what are the salient developments, I think sort of through that I realized I have, enough here to start, writing with this empirical basis. And then the other thing I did do was a lot of newspaper searching. So I have media sources, both older historical and newer, which is another thing that sort of does tie back to other work. Like I really realized partway through this book how much we're losing with the loss of local media. Like it wouldn't have been possible to write this kind of history without that kind of, there's some very, very local, very, very idiosyncratic, kind of this happened with the local penguin at the aquarium kind of thing. And of course, some of that's based on press releases, but like if we don't have that, we're missing just so much, as citizens and as scholars. Anyway, that was a tangent.
No. But yeah. Ties back to your first book in some ways. So, can you just set the scene for us a bit? I mean, what does this place look like that you're writing about? Like, what's there, and what are they like? So, the ports here, again, they hide in plain sight. They're about 20 miles due south of downtown LA. And on a clear day from some of the higher points in LA, you can see some of the cranes, but mostly they're pretty out of sight for a lot of, LA doesn't have a single center of gravity, but I would say it's fair to say that for a lot of the region, this is pretty out of sight, except for the people who, in classic infrastructure studies form, it's very foregrounded, right? Right.
If you work there or have family members who work there or live along the freeways, it's not invisibilized at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, the container and petroleum ports, there's a port complex that's partly administered by the city of Long Beach and partly administered by the city of Los Angeles, but they're physically contiguous. And it's just this one huge, smelly, smoggy industrial site. It's super secured also. You can't just like go walk around on it.
Yeah.
I was down there one day for some port PR event, and like you take a wrong turn leaving the event and there's like 4 cops,
oh wow,
port police coming up and sort of being like, are you lost? Do you need directions out of here?
I see. Yeah.
And even just like stopping the car to snap a picture with the cell phone or something, they're like really on you.
Huh.
And it's really, really big. And and it's connected to the freeways. And, so we think a lot of air pollution in Los Angeles, which again, I know you consulted your book on cars about some of that history. But we don't think of it as much often as the freight. But it's actually like passenger cars, because California has bad air and has therefore imposed pretty strict standards on the engines and passenger cars that then the rest of the country has too, because it's the same market. Diesel has gotten a big pass. And so the trucks are spewing all this really, nasty, bilious exhaust. And the cargo ships too, like they're coming into harbor. And again, the regulations are changing some. They're not supposed to be burning the dirtiest fuel, well, anymore at all right now, but also they're not supposed to be burning the dirtiest fuel if they're in the harbor, and they're supposed to plug into shore power. But overall, like it's created this really, really large pollution burden for the entire region, and not just LA, but extending inland where there's distribution infrastructure. And so on the one hand, you have this just like hyper industrial, kind of industrial sublime, noxious, cement and, oil refineries and, sort of steel and flame. And it smells like sulfur, and it's, kind of going as far as the eye can see. And then you also have this biodiversity, which also a lot of people, I've had people approach me since the book came out and say, I had no idea. But this is an area, because of marine life and bird life and plant life, it's regarded as like a really important wildlife corridor. So then the arc of the book is basically the last half century. So like the modern environmental movement to the present, and the kind of uneasy juxtaposition of environmental regulations on this site that's super important for containers and other kinds of goods and oil trade and movement, and sort of ultimately arguing that rather than being in conflict, they kind of support each other, like the regulations to protect wildlife or whatever, wind up getting kind of subsumed into the industrial mandate of the place. But to me, it's, as you can tell from my, again, babbling, it's this really, really fascinating, rich, sort of multi-layered place where you can see all these, kind of extreme contradictions at once. So maybe it's provincial, but I think it's like really interesting.
Yeah. So you talk in the intro, and it frames, the structure of your book is that you're drawing on this kind of multi-species perspective that's developed in STS, but other literatures too in the last couple decades. So did you know really quickly when you were starting to work on this project that you were going to go that route and have a kind of multi-species perspective, or did that develop as you were going along, or?
Some of column A, some of column B. And also, I would also say at the end of the day, the book is really influenced by that work, but it's not actually taking those sort of experiments as far as a lot of other scholars do. Like it's still at the end of the day, a book about human activity.
That's
but
fair.
It's sort of enfolding and relying on, we've all like STS 1.0, we all have read Haraway and, Latour, and these are, imprints that influence us in conscious and unconscious ways. And obviously, I think for many people, but myself included, Mushroom at the End of the World is sort of a touchstone. But also because it's about, economy too, right? Yeah. So like when I was writing the book proposal for this, I think the works that I said were not similar, but, that I was resting on included like Nature's Metropolis and The Mushroom at the End of the World. And so it's, multi-species, political economy, nature, all sort of together, and then my attempt at history. But yeah, it was a chance to really foreground literatures that, had some of which, again, are kind of foundational and I had maybe read but not worked in, and then update my own knowledge with, a lot of things that have come since. I felt fortunate to enter the conversation when I did, because I also feel like something that's been really important and coming out in work like in STS, Kim Tallbear and Zakiya Jackson, and also work in geography, for instance, really centering how race is central in thinking about, human ordering, and Euro-American, sort of Western ordering, and even asking multi-species questions. implicates those categories. And so, I was able to kind of, I think better on my feet with some of that, because of course the whole, all of the United States, but LA is a very, very glaring, sort of case of a, sort of racial order in the landscape and the urban development. So that's something I feel fortunate to have been able to sort of think with those newer literatures too.
Yeah, that's great. So your book is organized around 4 different life forms, and so they are birds, bananas, sea otters, and cetaceans, which is an order that includes whales and dolphins and porpoises. So how did you come to choose these 4? I mean,
Well, some of it is, again, a sort of artifact of method, and relying on news articles meant a foregrounding of things that get written about in press, which is often things that are sort of, charismatic or presented and constructed as charismatic. Originally, those chapters were a little more grouped around sort of analytics. It was going to be like life in captivity, life as commodity. I can't remember the others. And that's sort of in there still. But then I just wound up saying, you know what, I'm just going to do these 4 charismatic life forms. So there are advantages and disadvantages to doing that. A different book about a very, very similar set of topics could certainly foreground much less charismatic life forms. And sometimes I think maybe there will be like a sequel that addresses some of that. Certainly if I'd like embedded myself with scientists and done an ethnographic project, it probably would have been more like, we're trying to reintroduce this endangered species of abalone or something, things that are not without charisma, but not as sort of, telegenic or something as these other creatures. And then bananas, of course, don't seem like they fit with the others because they're not part of, the native inhabitants of the landscape. But that was actually important for the argument of the book, is to sort of look at the arc of this species that had been, introduced and brought through the ports at a very large volume for nearly an entire century, to sort of show some of the arc of labor and also just of shipping volume in the site. But that also allowed me to, all of these animals, I guess with the exception of otters that do live their lives, pretty close to the place that they are from, there are these, it's a port, right? So there's comings and goings and toings and froings from very distant places, in both, again, the sort of behavior of wildlife, but also in this commodity. And so it allowed me to kind of bring into focus a central claim, which is, what's happening here is a highly local and particular story, but it's part of global, planetary systems and, trade networks, and things like that. So that's kind of going on in all of those chapters.
So, what you also, you have this kind of infrastructural vitalism concept that you play with. So tell us a bit about that and why you found it useful to think in these terms of vitalism.
I don't know whether to start big or start small and telescope in or out, but we know that we're in a pretty perilous moment, with planetary heating and, world systems getting potentially, very out of whack, which has of course been building for centuries, but is, really intensifying in recent decades. And so while it is on the one hand, I think, unfashionable and incorrect to make really simplistic appeals to sort of life or nature or something, on the other hand, we are, in different ways implicated in a pretty existential struggle, I think. And this port site, the most even-handed thing I could say about it is still that it's like this really, really deadly place, really lethal, really death-dealing, really sort of multiplicative of harm
Yeah.
via multiple systems, including petroleum, including, extractive sort of volume of goods movement, and including the U.S. military, which we haven't really talked about, but is another sort of significant, motif or something in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And, sort of the U.S. empire, right? Which is really, again, on display once you train your focus to look at it in California. So, I was kind of playing with bigger ideas, sort of life and death, but I was also, because I'm an SPS scholar, like trying to not be too essentializing or too, crass, I guess, in thinking about those categories. But I was also influenced by, some of the work, sort of historical ontologies of infrastructure itself, and, the characterization of, water and electricity and things as, vital to national security and to sort of urban modernity projects. And so, again, the sort of the vital infrastructure is there in the language. And so, and again, this is more science studies, I guess, than some of my earlier work has had the chance to be. And so really thinking about the history of metaphors between, and here I didn't do this work myself, but leaning on work by others, metaphors that transfer ideas about circulation in the body, circulation of blood in particular, and circulation of, capital and goods, and the sort of interpenetration of those ideas and metaphors. And so I did keep sort of coming back to, there's some sort of, vital system, or, people believe that there is and act as if there is here. And then it's in the language, empirically too. Like we hear about, the lifeblood of the nation, or the freeway as an artery or a spine or something. And so I was sort of, again, it started out kind of playful, and then I became a bit more attempting to attend to it like more seriously and more analytically. But, I hope it literally, figuratively, I don't know, enlivens, the telling of the site, to have those sort of flickering distinctions between, death and life across the pages.
Yeah, it was interesting for me. I mean, one of the kind of things it reminded me a bit of was Thomas Hughes' momentum concept, just because it was like, there is like, I don't know, it's hard to talk about, right? Which is why we end up leaning on terms like vitalism. But it's like, at some point, these systems almost seem to have like a life of their own, right? Because we're serving them in all kinds of ways. They seem so important that like they just like seem like a force, and we do all kinds of things to keep them going. The thought that they might go away is like impossible to us or something like that, And so, yeah, I don't know. I thought it was a neat discussion.
Yeah, Hughes certainly really influential, and exactly that, that there's, even if we don't want to be too fast and loose with this conceptually, there is something there about, almost a sort of monstrous like autopoiesis or something.
Yeah.
And the stirrings of the system are not, I think that's a real question about, who's really in control. Because again, I can point to local and state and, sort of regional officials making decisions, but there is something about, global flows of capital that are moving and people are reacting to.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's those people who have tons of power. I feel like they often feel like things are out of their hands too, and they're just reacting to the world around them and in ways that they would see as far from ideal. So, yeah, there's something there. I want to leave, I don't want to give everything away in your book, because I think it's really nicely written and I want people to check it out. But I do want to just kind of like give listeners a sense of like how it moves a bit. And I thought we could just like talk about your birds chapter a bit. So, which is the first chapter. So like, what did you find, the first body chapter? Why'd you start with birds, and what did it like looking at the birds and following the birds like allow you to tell? Like, what did you want to see there?
well, again, this maybe starts with the fact that this is the Pacific coast from, Alaska to Patagonia is this migration route. And I'm actually having a hard time answering this as like where it starts, because I honestly don't even remember. Yeah. But so that's one thing that's just sort of in the site, is that there's historically would be heavy use by migratory birds and some local birds, but that have really sort of been crowded out and are now in sort of competition for coast with development, which right in San Pedro Bay, where the ports are nestled, is the port, but is also, just real estate and commercial use along the coast. So there's this migratory route on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's this infrastructure to respond to spilled oil, which has been coming online for decades. I think, quote myself, which I might or might not remember correctly, there's been discussion in scientific literature about like how to deal with the oil menace of oiled wildlife, since at least a century ago. But again, it's a sort of artifact of the modern environmental movement, which in California was galvanized by two big coastal spills in around 1969 and 1970. Mm-hmm. And the way, industry and environmentalists and the public and, regulators sort of came together to solve this problem here is basically that there's a little bit of revenue set aside from oil transactions to pay for, rehabilitation and remediation of spills and other, threats to wildlife. So again, it actually shows the sort of complementary relationship between, conservation and petroleum. Mm-hmm. And that's also another kind of public charismatic sort of way in, right? We recognize, that oiled birds are this, tragic spectacle.
Yes.
And so, as an analyst, you can find, representation of that. And then you can also, go and, pick at it a bit, sort of really like what underlies this, again, kind of naturalized assumption that there will be these discharges of oil and then that there will be, efforts to remediate it after the fact. But it's so naturalized that, that both will occur together, that, again, the petroleum industry is actually paying for these, conservation sites and activities. And there's never enough money, and they're always soliciting donations, right? So both where I live, the aquarium and the oiled bird facility are actually significantly funded by petroleum, and they're soliciting the public. And I think a lot of people who, care about wildlife and care about, conservation and care about climate change and all these things might give money to these entities, which are themselves, acting within the structures and strictures that they find. I'm not trying to sort of single them out as being, evil. And in fact, I don't think that they are, but that there's, it's not nakedly apparent that these sort of maybe conflicting mandates run through these institutions and, conservation impulses. So. Mm-hmm. So anyway, birds illustrates a lot of that. At least I hope it does. So
totally, I thought it was very successful. So here's an NPR question that I almost never ask. But I feel like your book is a study of a place, but I think actually you're making arguments that are much bigger than the place you're focusing on. So here's the NPR type question I almost never ask. What are you hoping that readers kind of like walk away from this book thinking about and, applying in a much bigger way than just thinking about the ports of LA?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think you're right. I think I do better research when I'm kind of emplaced, and this book is very about a place. Mm-hmm. But I also, do really hope to be making connections and arguments that are bigger than the place, because I don't know. Of course, when you're in Southern California, LA is really important, but I'm not actually sure that it is from other, vantage points. Like, I grew up in the upper Midwest and, lived on the East Coast for 25 years. And so, again, some of this is just my embarrassing California naivete presented in book form for all to see. But really, yeah, like the part of why this place is so important is 40% of containerized goods that enter the United States for consumption all across the country come in through here. And our energy system, again, has all these local effects here. And California is a really big user of oil and a really, big economy. But again, all of that is sort of fanning out in, particular ways and meso and miniature, all across the US. And so it's really a linchpin for systems that we're all participating in, even if we're nowhere near Southern California. Mm-hmm. And so that, I hope, is something that might, pique people's interest outside of the region. And as we're sort of looking ahead to, energy transition and whatever economic futures are, ahead of us and political futures, how this site is operated really does have, I think, lots and lots of downstream effects. And it is also tied in other ways to, the pipelines that are being, protested in so-called Canada and, Minnesota and Michigan.
Well, right out
and
backyard here in Appalachia too. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? You've got the gas...
Mountain Valley.
Yeah. So those don't literally physically connect to California, I think, because they don't go over the Rockies, but those are the same struggles, right?
Yeah.
So that stuff is all in here. And another really, I think, important thing to think about, which other people in infrastructure studies have been, writing about for a while, is these really important points where, a lot of things flow through them are also points of vulnerability, right? They're choke points. And so, there's a lot invested in the momentum, that keeps them humming and flowing. Mm-hmm. But they're also, I think, important to surface and think about, points of refusal, and whether that's a sort of like little blockade or something, or really just a place to say, like, we can see this system here and we don't want it to operate this way. And, what are all the steps that could be taken to sort of, halt or redirect this? I think it's really, a moment to be thinking that way. And so, where the book ends is really thinking about, energy transitions and resistance and honoring this site as a past, if we can ever get there, what would it actually take to like shut down a refinery in greater LA or elsewhere and like clean that up? It's really hard to overstate how toxic it is. And yet, that's something we have to imagine is politically feasible because we have to do it. So you're from the upper Midwest? Where you're from? St. Paul.
I don't know. Did we talk? Maybe we talked about that before. I'm a proud Midwesterner. So
you're Illinois, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a raging fight recently with someone whether Iowa was in the upper Midwest or not. And
I mean, these are very sensitive topics. They really are. So, what's up next for you, man? What do you have a next project? Are you going back to doing ethnography, or what's going on?
I have a few irons in the fire or something.
Yeah.
But again, speaking of burnout, I'm not writing a book for a little while. Like, I gave myself permission to just not do that for a while, and it feels good. So I have, again, a number of kind of threads that hang off Oil Beach that are stuff I'm pursuing. And some of them, again, kind of going into the, as I mentioned earlier, sort of anti-charisma, like sites
Yeah.
where wastewater is managed, or there are some sites in the LA harbor that I didn't even write about at all that are even more sort of obscured and invisibilized that I'm still fascinated by, both historically and, in the contemporary moment. I'm also interested in, again, some of the stuff we've touched on a little bit about like governance here.
Yeah.
There's a chapter in a book, and I can't recall the author right now, which is embarrassing, but that's about like, a port as a kind of almost a unit of legal analysis or something.
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
thinking
yeah.
about all of the regulations that run through it.
Yeah.
And getting a handle on that is actually surprisingly difficult. So I've been thinking some about, international, multilateral, sort of like port pollution kinds of agreements. There's a lot of like, energy, no pun intended, behind sort of greening the images of ports right now. And sort of, that's an international project with international, I think, public relations. Some of it coordinated, some of it maybe not. So one possibility where I may eventually get is something like a sequel that follows some of these things, and again, probably some of the less charismatic aspects through into, thinking about the governance of this site in the present. But that's really undeveloped. And I have a few other small things. There's actually an LPFM antenna in the Port of Long Beach.
Awesome.
So I'm not there at all, but I have thought like that would be a fun, I'm now in the, I guess, career stage where I just recycle things.
Yeah.
So I thought about like, what if I wrote something about that? And between you, me, and I guess your audience, I've been sort of messing around on Mastodon since Twitter exploded, and I may or may not be dredging a little of that into public view.
Right on. Is that
I'm
where
not
we find
promising
you now?
anything.
Are you on Mastodon primarily these days?
I am on Mastodon, and I do not find myself at all, drawn to Blue Sky, nor inclined to stay on Twitter. But that's been an interesting arc too. And, obviously we've interacted some there over the past few years for obvious reasons when, things were shut down. Like I didn't use Twitter before the pandemic, and then, quickly sang a different tune, with it becoming really essential in the early days for both good sort of pandemic information and everything else. So I'm kind of dabbling in some of those digital media kinds of projects, but not exclusively. Mainly I'm still working on the harbor and some of the things that aren't in Oil Beach, but
that's cool, man. All those sound like good topics. I also think it sounds very good for you to take a break, so I totally support that. Christina, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Likewise, Lee. Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.